Good morning. I'm Bonnie Gardner. I'm co-chair of the Public Affairs Forum of the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Austin. Our programs are free and open to the public and occur most Sundays at noon. Please consider coming. We're located at 4700 Grover Avenue. Our church mission is to nurture the mind and the spirit and to serve social justice. Today, I want to introduce Leslie Kearns, also our Forum Committee co-chair, who will introduce today's speaker. Leslie?
Thank you, Bonnie. Today we're very pleased to hear from Ann Beeson. She is the Executive Director of the Center for Public Policy Priorities, and she has been with them since 2013. She is a renowned social justice lawyer. She was previously Executive Director of U.S. programs at the Open Society Foundations, where she promoted human rights, justice, and accountability nationwide. Beeson was also the National Associate Legal Director of the ACLU. She argued twice before the Supreme Court, litigated numerous cases around the country, and launched groundbreaking programs to stop the erosion of civil liberties in the name of national security and to protect free speech and privacy on the Internet. She grew up in Dallas and received her graduate and undergraduate degrees from the University of Texas, and she obtained her law degree from the Emory University School of Law. She also served as law clerk to the Honorable Barefoot Sanders, then Chief Judge of the Northern District of Texas. Welcome, Ann.
Good morning. Thank you so much for being here. I feel lucky to be here in two ways and grateful that you all are here. Lucky to be here because you all are a very socially engaged community of faith, and it is so critical that we have more and more spaces and opportunities for people to be engaged, and I'm going to say a little bit more about that as we go along. And also just happy that you're here inside on a stunningly beautiful day, one of the first sunny days we've had on a weekend in a while with all the rain. So I hope you get the chance after this to go outside and enjoy the beautiful weather. I want to just first tell you what I'm doing these days. Thank you so much, Leslie, for the introduction. I've had a kind of a long career and have had the privilege and the honor of working on a whole range of justice issues, from human rights and social justice to now focusing on economic justice in our communities and in our state. And I am currently working for a wonderful organization that has been around for 30 years, and I will call it by our little shortened form because we have a mouthful of a name. We call ourselves CPPP, which stands for the Center for Public Policy Priorities. And CPPP believes in a Texas that gives every Texan the chance to succeed in life. And what we do is we use data to advocate for solutions that give Texans of all backgrounds the opportunity to reach their full potential. We have a great origin story, which I'll share because it seems very appropriate for the surroundings, which is that we were actually founded by a group of Benedictine sisters in Boerne, Texas, 30 years ago. And these sisters had been very, very active in social justice, and they were working in particular to minister to people with severe health problems. And they got, frankly, very fed up at just kind of providing charity and ministering to very sick people. And they saw that the reason that we were having so many health issues in our communities was because, of course, we didn't have affordable health care. We didn't have preventive care. And they got fed up with this and decided that, they were going to, by God, go and, found a policy organization so that they could change public policy on healthcare, and that's what they did. And our organization became independent of them many years ago, but they're very near and dear to our hearts, and they are still very active and engaged in their own way. And it goes to show you just how much can be accomplished when just a few people, with a belief, get to work. Now our organization is the largest nonprofit progressive policy organization in the state. We have about 25 fabulous staff people that work all over, and they're proud of us, and we're very proud of them. So I wanted to share that with you. I don't know how you all are feeling, but here we are. We had an election last week. We seem to be in perpetual election mode, and I don't know if anybody else is already feeling very fatigued by the 2016 2015 election. Okay, here we are. It's just 2015, just as a reminder, right? We're not in 2016 yet, and we're already feeling, I think, fatigued by it. And one of the reasons why that is because, elections have come more and more to be times when we focus on personalities, and that's certainly true, especially this time around, and where we frankly focus a lot on our differences. We focus on what keeps us apart and what makes us different, and the things we don't agree on. Well, what I want to do this morning is flip the switch a little bit and focus instead on what I think most Americans really believe in. We have a lot of different opinions about how to get there. But the fact of it is, all of us want a decent future for ourselves and our children and our grandchildren. And we tend to even agree about what that means, what that requires in a lot of cases, especially when you're talking about economics. What that means is that we all want the opportunity to be healthy and have our families be healthy. We all want to be well educated and be able to pursue a career and a life of our choice. And we want to be able to be financially secure so we're not constantly sort of struggling just to make ends meet for our families. And I want to talk a little bit about how we can work together across all the differences that seem to keep us increasingly polarized in our communities and in our state and in our country, and what we can do together to expand opportunity, especially focused here in Texas. And just as I'm kind of sharing some information and stories with you, I really would just ask you to reflect a little bit on the kind of history of your own family, because often that's all it takes to make these numbers that I'm going to share with you very real, right? And I'll just begin as you're doing that by just kind of sharing a little bit of my own story, right? So I grew up in Dallas, as Leslie said, and my folks, my family's been, we're kind of the classic mutts. We've been in America for a very, very long time, and my parents are both from Kansas, actually, and they had come down. Like most people moved to another state because there were jobs for my dad. My dad worked for Sears his whole career. My mom was a high school teacher her whole career. They were part of that post-Depression, 50s, 60s kind of boom in America, where a lot of people don't really think about this. We actually built in this country the largest middle class that the world has ever seen during that period, right? And I am the beneficiary of that. I'm the beneficiary of those policies, and so were my parents. And that was a period of time, right, where you could, have jobs like that and buy a house and start your family when you were in your 20s. Put yourself through college. Raise your kids and have your kids have the ability to put themselves through college. You didn't have to save hundreds of thousands of dollars, literally, to have your kid go to the college of their choice, right? And a lot of that, again, there were very deliberate policies at the time that made this possible for my parents. And now, kind of fast forward, and, I'm raising my family now, and I'm looking not just at, my son, who's a sophomore up the street at McCallum, but also at my nephews and nieces and watching them struggle. And the fact of it is we're in a very, very different place now in America. And the opportunities are becoming more and more and more limited financially and economically. And that, again, is because of a deliberate set of policies that were sort of pushed. And that's, we can get all mad about that, and we're going to talk about what those policies are and what the current state is. But I mainly want you to see that as like an opportunity, and that's why I want to connect it to history and to your own family experience, because we changed it once before, and the reason we changed it is we changed it because of the stock market crash of the 1920s, and we changed it because of the Depression. We said, no, we can't have a situation where there's extreme poverty. We can't have a situation where all the money is at the top, in the top 1%, and everybody else is struggling. We've got to have policies that make it possible for everyone to share in the wealth and opportunity in our country. We can get there again, and that's really what I want the message of this talk to be about. So I want to focus on Texas. And the reason I want to focus on Texas is not just because we all live here and it's my home, but because what happens here in Texas matters nationally. And that's why it's even more important, if anything, for us to be engaged and active than it is for folks in other states, and I really mean that. 1 in 11 Americans lives in Texas. That's a kind of a shocking statistic, okay? 27 million people live in our state, okay? So our policy is essentially national policy, because what happens here affects so many people in the overall country that essentially is going to have a ripple effect on everything that happens, and we are, as you know very well, on the leading edge of a profound democratic change nationally. We're already a majority-minority state, and all the other states are beginning to look a lot more like Texas in that way. And we have a habit, for better or worse, and I think a lot of us often recently think it's been for worse, of exporting both our leaders and our policies to the rest of the country. Okay? And so a lot of the policies that have led to the situation we find ourselves in today are now being exported to other parts of the country into the national stage. And so I want to just focus a little bit on, okay, well, what can we look at? What are the positives about Texas, and what do we have to build on, and what are the barriers to opportunity? And actually, I also want to focus a little bit on a very important barrier, which is, the challenges that we have working across our differences, both political and ideological. But first, let me say a little bit about, the assets we have to work with here in Texas. So we do have a lot to be proud of, and I think we're a kind of fiercely proud culture here in Texas, and we have very big cities which are thriving. We have successful businesses that are creating jobs. Over 40% of the job growth in the entire United States happened here in Texas between 2000 and 2013. I'm going to say a little bit about why that hasn't solved our problems in a minute, but none of us would say that's a bad thing. Of course, it's a good thing that we have a lot of jobs and we can continue to draw people from other parts of the country because we are good at creating jobs. We also have a real belief and support for innovation and entrepreneurship in Texas, which is a big plus. And we all know that we have a very thriving cultural and creative community and creative sector, which is which I actually think we don't tap enough for social change purposes. We think of it as like a business sector, which it is, but it's also, there's a huge opportunity to engage the creative sector here in Texas in social change work and in social justice work. And we have a lot of human and financial capital. 27 million people is a lot of people to work with. We have over 50 Fortune 500 companies, and, we can talk about the challenge in terms of income inequality, but that is wealth here that we could transform through policies if we got committed around that. Now, the challenges that we have to working together, again, too often now, and this wasn't true, I don't think, even 20, 25 years ago, debates about issues that affect everyone, issues like education and healthcare and transportation, are extremely polarized and politicized. So we can't even talk, even though the issues are affecting all of us, in everyone's family, we can't actually just have a straight conversation about what are we trying to get to and what are the facts that would inform the policies that we need to improve the situation for more Americans. And then, as if that wasn't bad enough, the polarization, increasingly policy debates are not focused on the real facts. They're actually focused on misinformation. And that is a huge challenge for an organization like mine, which produces independent research and data, because the other side can just come out with misinformation, and then you're in this he said, she said, and the media is sort of not doing the job that they need to be to say, this is credible research, factual information, peer-reviewed information and data, and these are incorrect and not true. And it's a big problem. And finally, way too few Texans are socially engaged, civically engaged, like clearly all of you are, or you wouldn't be here at this talk. And this is kind of an interesting and very depressing fact. There's a recent report that showed that consistently over the past many years, Texas ranks dead last, literally dead last in voter turnout. And I'm going to just posit to you that is not a coincidence, that's actually very related to a lot of other data I'm about to share with you about the challenges to opportunity in Texas. And think about it. If you're working 2 or 3 jobs just to make ends meet, are you going to have time to kind of go out and participate in that rally? Are you going to have time to get out and vote? It's going to be a lot harder for you. And also, there's a real problem with kind of non-competitive races. The polarization is keeping people who would otherwise be engaged away from civic engagement. There are a lot of challenges. And again, I would say the one thing we have to fix before we can fix everything else is to change that equation and get more people involved and engaged in civic life year-round, not just by going and voting, but by being engaged in policy advocacy, like I know, again, many of you are. Okay, so where are we with opportunity in Texas right now? Texas, unfortunately, has one of the highest rates of poverty in the country. We have close to an 18% poverty rate. We're 38th out of 50. And 1 in 4 children in Texas lives in poverty. And that is a very disturbing number, again, because of what I said before. We're at this leading edge of a demographic trend. We're going to see more and more of that as time goes by in other states as well. And at the same time, you all know we have a huge amount of wealth. I said that a minute ago, right? We have all these billionaires and millionaires in Texas. Well, you won't be surprised to hear that income inequality, which we're, thank goodness we started a national conversation about, is worse here in Texas than in many other states. And we rank, in fact, here in Texas among the top 10 states for income inequality in the nation. The Dallas metro area, in fact, my hometown of Dallas, has the highest level of income inequality between neighborhoods in the country. And you might not think that. You don't think of Dallas when you think of the most wealthy. You think of, probably, some of those northeastern states where you think all the rich people, or California, someplace like that, or Wyoming, where a lot of celebrities have moved. Nope, it's Dallas, Texas, has the highest level of income inequality in the country. And what we see, obviously, is that, it's two totally different worlds. We have, at the one end, a situation where we are tied for the highest number of adults lacking a high school degree in the country, and we have the highest number of uninsured people in the country in Texas. And we all know that these figures are even worse, of course, for people of color and immigrants. And that is due both to the history of structural racism and its impact here in Texas and nationally, a history of sort of xenophobia and anti-immigrant sentiment, as well as a very persistent lack of investment in the public structures that help people get, a leg up and help people have the opportunity to get through college and get into a career that pays a living wage. This has changed dramatically here in Texas and also nationally since the 70s, to go back to my own personal story. And what you see here, and I think it's just hard for us to, because we're all living our lives and we don't really think about these trends because it's not our job to think about these trends, right? But in fact, as we've been living our lives for the last, 10, 20, 30, 40 decades, depending on your age, this massive change has been going on behind the scenes because of policies. And even though our productivity keeps going up, our productivity is going up. It's not a problem of there isn't wealth and, stuff getting produced. That's happening. And we know that obviously the cost of living is continuing to go up too, kind of in connection with sort of that rising productivity. At the same time, wages have completely stagnated, absolutely stagnated for middle-class people in this country. And so, everything else is rising, and your average worker, your average person out there is not, is having to get by with less and less and less and less. And at the same time, our policies, our social safety net policies, are shrinking and shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. Now, I'm, dealing with a situation right now where my parents, who, again, had a very lucky kind of, life, and they're kind of, during their career, are now, like so many people in their age group, really struggling. Like, they didn't save quite as much as they needed to because everything costs so much more, and the safety net has shrunk even more. Thank God my dad happens to be a veteran of the Korean War, or we would be in an even more we would be in a very difficult situation in terms of getting the care that we need for my dad, who happens to have Alzheimer's. But he's a veteran, and so he gets a benefit that not everyone gets. And what is that benefit? That benefit is a public policy that says we believe that, people that have served in the armed forces shouldn't be destitute and not able to get the care they need. Well, we need to have that kind of approach to the policies, for everyone in this country, and that's what we've increasingly gone away from, as you all know very well. So we created something just to kind of illustrate this in different parts of Texas. At CPPP, we created something called the Family Budgets Tool that actually tells this story from a very real situation in different parts of Texas. And what it basically does is it says it tells you how much it takes to actually get by with the most basic, necessities. So let's just assume this is like, obviously your housing costs, or if you're a renter, it's your rent, and if you're, a homeowner, it's your mortgage, the cost of health care, the cost of child care, the cost of transportation, the cost of food, right? And what this Family Budgets tool does, and I encourage you to go online and look at it if you want, and play around with it afterwards, is it tells you, based on real research and data, how much that costs in Austin, how much it costs in Dallas, how much it costs in the Rio Grande Valley or Houston. And then it compares that cost to the average wages in that place. And it says how much would you have to make to actually be able to pay for these basic necessities, right? Well, unfortunately, here in Austin, I'm going to use Austin. Austin's one of our most expensive cities. Many of you know this. So, and you're able to put in things like, how big is the family? Is your employer paying for health care? Most people don't have that luxury. Some people do. And this particular set of numbers I'm going to share with you assumes that it's 2 working adults with 2 kids, and they actually do get health care coverage from their employer. And the combined hourly wage that it takes for 2 people in that situation here in Austin is $25, okay? $25. Well, you all know that the federal minimum wage is only $7, just over $7. Well, what does this mean? It means that people are having to work 2-3 jobs just to barely get by. And that absolutely wasn't true just 25 years ago. Now, let's get back to the jobs in Texas. I said, isn't it great? Texas is creating all these jobs. Well, guess what? We happen to be very, very good here in Texas at creating those low-wage jobs. 41% of all of the jobs that were created in Texas in the last several years are jobs that are low-wage jobs. These are jobs that pay between $7 and $13 an hour, which, again, isn't enough money for that family to meet basic needs. And that's like the barest, analysis of what it would take to meet basic needs. It doesn't include the cost of, a cell phone, which you pretty much have to survive, now. It doesn't, include the cost of saving for, birthday parties or college or anything else. Child care, as you know, the cost of child care has gone up and up and up, and in the meantime, we have not invested in certain policies like pre-K, public pre-K, that would really help our families in 2 ways, both by preparing young people for school, and there's so much data that shows that kids do so much better the earlier they get into some, a program like pre-K, but also because it serves as a work support for families that is much more affordable than obviously paying for daycare. And then the other set of figures that I wanted to share with you, which contributes to why it is that people are making these low wages and which is contributing to both increased poverty in Texas as well as rising income inequality, is the kind of leaky educational pipeline. And this is going to be another one of those figures that's probably hard for you to believe. So in the last few years in Texas, if you're talking about the current class of 8th graders, let's just focus on the current class of 8th graders. This is what the research is based on in Texas. Only 16% of those 8th graders will actually complete any kind of higher education credential. And I'm not talking about 4-year college. I'm even including in that figure, community colleges or any kind of a technical degree that, as we all know, would help them actually get a job that might pay a wage that might just be enough to meet what it actually takes to get by. Only 16% of girls in the 8th grade, of boys in the 8th grade, and only 23% of girls in the 8th grade are completing a higher education credential. Well, why is that? Again, so many barriers. Part of it is goes back to the beginning and the fact that there's a whole set of young people, and that's more true if you're a young person of color, if you're a young undocumented immigrant, than it is if you're a white person. They're not getting the support that they need to enter school and then succeed at school, right? And then, of course, what happens is that college has become so expensive. The cost of college here in Texas has gone up 55% since 2003. That's just a little over 10 years ago. 55%. And so what happens is this awful cycle where, the kids start college and they go into debt, and then they can't pay the debt, and, they can't pay their bills, and so then they drop out of college and they've got both the debt and they still don't have a degree that gives them, a living wage. So, and again, many of us, we probably see these stories in our own families. I see it with, my nephews and nieces who are in that phase of their life now. So it's really critical, if we're going to kind of change this equation, to recognize that these barriers, are structural and they're systemic, and they can actually be overcome with concrete policy solutions. Because, again, it looked different, It looked different in the 60s and 70s and 80s. It could look different again in another 10 years. If only we can be committed to changing the policies that we all must live by. And I want to say, in case I sound too nostalgic, I think it's very important to say we need to build those policies in a way that is equitable and fair for everyone. And we did not do that in many other periods where certain segments of our communities and societies were able to thrive and others were shut out. And there's a whole lot of research, of course, that shows that the fact that we had intentional racism and discrimination built into some of our good policies, the same policies that my family got to move up the ladder through, many of those policies the last time around were discriminatory. So we need to change those and the next time build them so that everyone has a chance to benefit from our policies. So I want to talk just about a few very specific things that should be our policy priorities to change the kind of opportunity ladder here in Texas. And none of these are going to sound hopefully too wonky. They're all pretty straightforward, actually. The first one is that we absolutely must raise the minimum wage. And the conversation that we're having, okay, it's not even the right conversation. Thank God we're having a conversation about minimum wage now, but even President Obama is out there pushing for $10.10 an hour to have the federal government raise it. Well, remember those figures that I shared with you? That is actually still not enough to get by. It's not, and it's certainly not enough to build any assets like my parents' generation was able to do. Not enough to save to buy a house. Not enough to save to send your kid to college, especially if college, even at a public university, costs tens of thousands of dollars a year, like it does now in Texas, right? So we have got to raise the minimum wage, and we have got to resist any argument from the business side that this can't be done. We know that we have this huge amount of concentrated wealth at the top, and that kind of difference, that income inequality, those figures have changed so radically that there's plenty of wealth up there to kind of redistribute to the middle class and to low-income folks, while still recognizing that, there's still a ladder to climb up, so to speak. So we've got to raise the minimum wage. Here in Texas, we have a terrible law that not only we just go by the federal minimum, we actually have a state law that preempts cities from raising the minimum wage. Many parts of the country, even in conservative states, cities in those states because they get it, are raising wages for all the workers and requiring private workers to pay a higher wage. Here in Texas, we have a law that preempts our cities, which is where most of the people live, from actually raising the minimum wage. The first thing we need to do is get rid of that law. Now, there are efforts going on, and this is a step, and it was committed citizens that got us this far. There are efforts around the state to raise the minimum wage, at least for city employees and contractors, and that has now been done, I'm excited to say, in Austin. It's been done in San Antonio. It's been done in Houston, and Dallas is about to consider it. But that's a tiny percentage of all the workers. These are just the people that work for the city or work for an organization that contracts with the city. So we need to remove that preemption and raise wages, and we need to also be arguing at the national level to raise wages. We also must invest in pre-K. I don't know how many of you heard, but our Governor Abbott himself, was out there talking about pre-K being a priority, okay, which is great on the one hand, but here's where you got to hold your politicians accountable for what they're talking about. What we ended up with at the end of the legislative session, in this last legislative session last year, is we ended up with an amount of funding for pre-K that didn't even begin to meet what it was prior to 2011. You all may remember that we cut billions of dollars out of the budget, the Texas state budget for education in 2011. So all we did is and this was like Governor Abbott, calling it an emergency item and saying we have to fund pre-K, is we put in half the amount of money we used to have, which means that there isn't anywhere near the same number. And in the meantime, our population is exploding and exploding and exploding. More and more kids need access to pre-K. We have got to invest in pre-K. And from a business perspective, it makes sense. And thank goodness that with this policy, we have the business community on our side. they get it. They understand that you have to invest very early on in order to have kids be able to be successful in school, be able to kind of move ahead into college or kind of a technical degree or community college, and be able to be a skilled worker, which is what those businesses actually need to continue to thrive. So you can make a business case for this policy as well. And we've got to do it. We've got to expand investment in pre-K. We also, of course, have to look at every other possible option to change that terrible statistic around 16% of 8th grade boys and 23% of 8th grade girls getting through to a higher degree. Because if we don't do that, the numbers that I shared with you in terms of the rising poverty in all of our cities in Texas are going to continue to get worse and worse and worse. And that is not good for anyone. I mean, it's not good for anyone. You can't have a sustainable economy based on those numbers. I'm happy to report that we have already seen some real change in certain parts of our state. And there's a brilliant leader down in the Rio Grande Valley. His name is Dr. King, and he has radically transformed the numbers down there. They had one of the highest rates of sort of high school dropouts in the country, and they have, of course, one of the highest poverty rates there as well. And through focusing on kind of solutions that worked, he has now changed a kind of a 60% graduation rate down there in his school district, which is the Far San Juan school district, to over 90%, which is higher than the national average. And this is in one of the poorest school districts in the country. So it can be done. And the way that he has done that is actually by focusing on solutions like dual enrollment, where kids, when they're juniors and seniors in high school, get the chance to actually take classes that count for community college credit. Now, what does that do? That means they're taking those. They're not paying for them, so it doesn't cost as much. By the time they then get to college, the college is going to be more affordable because they don't have as many credits left. And it also puts them on the path to a college degree before they even graduate from high school, right? And then there are great models around early college, high school, where they leave, high school a little early and begin college. So the other thing that we've seen a lot of success with are two-generation strategies. Unfortunately, we have a kind of an environment and a climate where, even conservatives sometimes, will be compassionate enough to say we need to do something to help low-income kids succeed. But there's this whole thing about, but we don't want to help the parents in the meantime, right? Well, that's nutty. We have to have two-generation strategies that look at families as the whole units they are and that help support the kids with pre-K, right? With even earlier educational opportunities like Head Start, at the same time that they're helping parents get back on track. It can't be that we're just focusing on the kids. We have to focus on the whole family, and we should be, pairing things like early education with parent access to job training. We should be, making sure that community colleges always provide access to childcare for their students. So I want to just sort of close because I want to get into conversation with you all and just sort of say, what can you do? Clearly, you're already engaged. You're here this morning. It's so critical that we all stay informed and engaged. And I would say we have to keep the conversation going. If there's one thing that you do, it would be to take some fact that you learned today, some solution you learned today, and go and have a conversation with someone you know about it. Your family members, who we all try to avoid talking politics with. We've got the Thanksgiving meal coming up, so there's a big opportunity there. Your social networks, your work colleagues. And, try, one of the things I've been trying to do, because I get so frustrated at all the conversations we end up having about Donald Trump, is whenever you find yourself in a situation like that where we're talking once again about candidates and people and who they are and what their hair looks like and all that, switch that conversation and say, you know what? I just heard that only 16% of 8th grade boys are going on to college in Texas. I heard that we have the highest rate of income inequality in the country. What are we going to do about that? And try to switch it and flip it and start talking about concrete policies that we must fix. And obviously, there's so many other opportunities to host forums. Think about how you can do that. And there's so many great tools out there for you to use to kind of have meaningful conversations with data. So I really encourage you all to do that. I want to say, as one small thing you could do if you're interested, we have a a kind of an online newsletter that always has like fun little facts and opportunities to get engaged and involved. And if any of you are interested in getting that information from the Center for Public Policy Priorities, I've got a little sign-up sheet and I've got a pen. And if you want to sign up, I'd love for you to do that. And the one other thing that I would recommend to you, which you all may have seen, is a fantastic documentary film called Inequality for All. That came out about 2 years ago, and Robert Reich, of course, is the kind of star facilitator of the whole thing. He does a great job of telling the story I just tried to tell, but in a more thorough way. And the website that accompanies the film, Inequality for All, is a fantastic resource too to kind of help you get tools to sort of have these conversations with your fellow residents and friends and colleagues. So I'm going to stop there and just open it up for questions because I know there was a lot of data there. Yeah.
Thank you, Anne. Mm-hmm. Wonderful talk.
I always have questions.
Great.
You talked about the 50s and 60s being kind of this different time frame, and I often hear Republican candidates talking about want to get back to how it used to be in the 50s and 60s, and yet at that time the top marginal tax bracket was about 90%. You didn't comment at all about tax policies affecting any of this. Do you want to make a few remarks on that?
Oh, absolutely. And our organization actually works on tax policy. It's one of our big areas of expertise and focus. And, you could do, and I often don't get into it in talks like this because it can get very complex, but there isn't any question that our tax policy is largely responsible for the situation we find ourselves in today, too. And, of course, that's particularly true here in Texas. We have long been a kind of no tax, which is nutty, low tax, limited regulation kind of a state, right? And this is, when people tell you that, when they say, Texas is kind of isn't it great that we don't have an income tax in Texas? Well, if you actually look at the tax burden here, in fact, all that means is that you're paying taxes somewhere else. And we still aren't paying enough to kind of support decent schools, support health care in the state. So, Texas is unfortunately, at the leading edge of unbelievably regressive tax policies, which perpetuate this inequality, we give huge tax breaks to businesses at the top end, and we give almost nothing to kind of the little guy at the bottom end. And that is, in fact, one of those sets of policies that Texas is now trying to export to other places. So unfortunately, I hesitate to even bring this up because it makes me so unhappy. You all know last Tuesday, many of you probably voted in the election, and one of the things that we did, unfortunately, is that we passed a constitutional amendment which permanently takes money from the general fund of the Texas state budget and dedicates it to highways and transportation. And the problem is, when you read that, I'm not going to ask how people voted because we tried our best to sort of tell the real story, and most people didn't. We couldn't even get the media to really cover it the right way. Everybody, they read that, they're like, well, of course, we hate all of us hate having, roads that have huge potholes in them and highways that don't work and all that. But do we really want to permanently take that money from the general fund and say all we care about forevermore is spending that money on highways? What that means is that money is now forevermore unavailable for education and healthcare. That's what it means. And so we do this thing where instead of saying we need to invest more, and if we don't invest more now, we're going to have to spend more money later, right? We just move. It's like this shell game. We move things around and we take money from something and we put it towards something else, and we have not fixed the problem. And, in the meantime, it may look like you're getting these tax breaks, but your property taxes are going up and up and up. And the reason they're going up and up and up is because there are no other taxes to pay for public services that support our communities. So tax policy is a big part of it.
Excellent talk. Thanks so much. Can you break those percentages down by race? The 16% and the 24% for girls and boys. Second, what's the annual income for Austin to be affordable to live in this community?
Mm-hmm. Yes, we have the data to answer your first question, but I didn't bring it with me. But it is available absolutely on our website. And as you can imagine, the percentages, it's, much, much more likely for kids of color to be in that, vast percentage that are the ones that aren't getting through than it is for white kids. And that's even more true of Hispanic kids than it is of African American kids, but it's true of both. The second question, yeah, I do have that data actually with me. So I don't have it broken out into an hourly wage, but basically, oh yeah, I do. The necessary annual income for the family to get by here in Austin is $50,000, right? That's and again, that makes a lot of assumptions that aren't really, realistic because there's so many other things that families have to pay for now. So the minimum amount that they would have to make is $50,000 just to pay for rent, food, child care, health care, transportation, and other very basic necessities. So.
Hi. I wanted to just ask about something that may or may not be what you focus on, but I saw a video recently of essentially police almost assault on some young people of color that happened Wednesday night in Austin, Texas. For the wrongdoing was jaywalking, apparently. And I just wanted to ask if you have any ideas about policies around justice and policing and jails and criminality, that the impacts of those.
Absolutely. And what I'll mainly do is connect those to the story that I told because they're all absolutely related, right? At the same time that you have, corporate regulation that favors, or lack of regulation and policy that favors, corporations to the exclusion of individuals, you have other policies, including kind of the war on drugs and the focus on mass incarceration that have happened over the same time period and particularly served as a structural barrier in communities of color, right? And this is one of the things that's also influencing that 16% number, especially for the boys, right? Because you have a whole system that is basically pushing, and this is what we call the school-to-prison pipeline, it's pushing young people through very harsh disciplinary practices in schools into the criminal justice system instead of helping support them to be successful students, right? And you have community policing practices like the one that this video caught, which are much harsher and focused on communities of color and end up in this much higher likelihood, of course, that if you're a young person of color, you're going to get caught up in the criminal justice system. And once that happens, I mean, essentially your life is over, and that's just not the kind of community we all want to live in. It's critical that we all get involved in criminal justice reform. I will say on the policy side, I was very involved in criminal justice work when I was at the ACLU, and it's one of the areas where we've seen real progress, and the reason that we have is because conservatives have jumped on the bandwagon because they've seen that we are spending a huge amount of money locking people up, and it's costing the state a huge amount of money, right? Now, what I would say, as a self-identified progressive, is we need to be taking that money that we're spending on the jail and prison system and investing it instead in education, which, guess what, is a whole lot more affordable and it's a whole lot better outcomes for everyone if we do that. Unfortunately, what happens is that they just want to give you another tax cut. They just want to cut that money out of the budget. They don't want to spend it on education, and that's where I think that's the distinction between the kind of progressives for criminal justice reform and conservatives for criminal justice reform. But we are seeing some shift in terms of the numbers of people coming down. The numbers coming down in terms of the number of people being incarcerated from even just 5-10 years ago. Yeah.
Yes, you talked about low voter turnout, which is a source of deep frustration. Is there some place, I always hear we rant and rave about the Republican conservative agenda. Is there some place, very simple, easy to read, easy to follow, statement about what we are for rather than what we are against? Because we've got Thanksgiving dinner coming up, and I'd love to have, to be able to say, this is explicitly what I'm for versus ranting and raving about Trump at all.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I mean, I would say I'm trying to think of like a single place that you could go and get that, and I think it's a great idea to however you form that agenda, to do it in a way that isn't explicitly identified with the party. You know what I'm saying? Because you're going to get farther in your conversation if you do that. And if you say, I'm for an education system that makes, I'm for investing in public education, investing in health care, so people can actually have productive lives. That's what we're for. We're against discrimination, that not only is, wrong, but also is bad for our economy. It just is. I think you can get there. I mean, my first instinct when you asked me the question was to sort of send you to the, I was thinking it was more around like how to get, really informed on the issues that everybody's talking about in the election. And I would say if that's the issue, I would definitely recommend like the League of Women Voters is still a fantastic resource in kind of giving you very objective information. But it's not the agenda that you're looking for. And we get this a lot on the progressive side because we are involved in so many different issues. It can sometimes seem like the kitchen sink thrown in, right? But I do think that there's a way to talk about it where it's as simple as saying, we're for investing in education and healthcare and healthy communities and a healthy climate, right? And we're against kind of discrimination and singling out, some people for discrimination and others for privileged treatment. And it's as simple as that, I would say. Yeah.
Yeah. How can we stop electing officials who aren't a public embarrassment to be from Texas?
That's a great question. Run for office would be my first suggestion. Yes, unfortunately, it has become such an embarrassment that many of the most inspiring, amazing young people are discouraged from getting into politics at all. Not to mention the of course, very corrupting influence of money and the fact that you have to have a huge amount of money to do that. But it has to start local. We have to continue to do everything we can to get young people, diverse young people, young leaders engaged in at the local level, and then help build them up and help support them to sort of ultimately run for office. And there are great efforts like that going on here in Texas. The one that I would highlight for you is Annie's List, which does great work supporting young women, especially young women of color, all around Texas in running for public office. And there's actually a great group called the League of Young Voters, too, that does a lot of work like that, supports young candidates to run for office. Yeah.
I'm very aware of underfunding of mental health services in Texas, and it seems also as if here in Austin we have a chronic problem with that, and we have an exploding population, great need, and in fact, the suicide rate in Austin, Travis County is twice that of the homicide rate. What might we do statewide to increase access to mental health services, and how do we fund them better? Any ideas?
That's a great question, and we're actually very involved in that issue at the center. And it's another area where I'm actually I'm more optimistic about the mental health policy world than I am some of the other issues we work on, for the same reason that I was about the criminal justice situation. And that is because what we're seeing more and more is we're seeing a left-right coalition come together around mental health reform. And that is because, again, we are spending – okay, this is another fact to kind of shock you, and I'm sure you probably know it, which is that the number one provider of mental health services in the state of Texas is our jail and prison system. The number one provider is our jail and prison system. That costs a huge amount of money. It costs so much money, much more money than providing access to community-based treatment, right? And so, again, the kind of, fiscal conservatives have said, oh, my gosh, this doesn't make any sense. And so they're working with progressives to change the equation. And we have actually seen an increase in mental health funding at the state level. It's still nowhere near what it needs to be, so don't get me wrong. We need to keep making this case. But we have seen some real progress, and we've been very involved in that as well with our allies here in Texas. And we've also seen some kind of very innovative solutions, including the use of what are called mental health peers, who are people who are living with mental illness themselves and have been trained to provide support and services. And we were successful in getting a bill passed last legislative session that supports the use of mental health peers in jails and prisons. And when you see that, you see much better outcomes for the people that those peers have worked with. They're much less likely to end up back in the criminal justice system because the peers help them connect to the medication they need, connect to the services they need, and the community-based care they need once they're out of prison. So,
if you look at the historical facts for the past 65 years, we've seen a progressive attempt towards transforming the New Deal a great society, war on poverty, to war on drugs, and consequently transferring monies from structural improvement to the social order.
Yes.
So we will have these problems have turned into a very difficult situation for a lot of people. At the same time, a small minority of well-organized people with lots of resources have progressively chipped down and chipped away the rights of the citizens. Also, they have falsified the nation as a whole to make them unaware of what's happening to them. So, given those circumstances, what avenues you see for the public to have more representation for the taxation?
Well, I would say that there are, and you referenced this in your question, an increasing number of structural barriers to voting, right? And I was a lawyer for many years. We had a voting rights project. I could not believe more in all of the advocacy that's being done to overcome the structural barriers to voting. And we know we have a whole new one here in Texas with the voter ID law, right? But I will also tell you that if you look at the numbers, if you look at the sheer numbers, we could overwhelm those structural barriers if we could just solve the turnout problem, right? If we could just motivate. I mean, we had an election last Tuesday. 12% of people in Austin came out and voted. And actually, that's considered high for an election of that kind because we weren't voting on candidates. That's just unacceptable. And those numbers are about registered voters. They don't even get at all the people who aren't even registered to vote. So, yes, it's absolutely true. We have to continue to be involved in advocacy, and many of us can do that. You can be a poll monitor. You can get involved in the structural barriers and try to help, especially those citizens who are most often excluded. There are many ways for you to get engaged, but I would say that even more important than doing that is going out there, whatever avenue you can find, and organizing people just to get engaged and vote. Now, I'll say, because I'm very obsessed with civic engagement, that I don't think the answer is to do that only when we have an election. I think that is the model that has failed miserably for the last many years, right? Is thinking that you can go out in the month or two before an election and suddenly get people to care about government. Can't be that. We have to get people engaged year-round, however that works for them. And whatever you're passionate about, whatever your friends and your loved ones are passionate about, find a way for them to influence the policies that affect that thing. And get them engaged that way, and then build that up and make sure that they also come out to vote, I would say.
I have another question, since there don't seem to be any more from the audience. I think that there's a new initiative to privatize or even eliminate or cut Social Security benefits, Social Security disability benefits. Even middle class or upper middle class people realistically cannot save enough for retirement, a comfortable retirement, without those available to them. Yet there's a lot of misinformation on that subject. Is your center beginning to take on this issue, and do you see any growing awareness of the need to fight against these incipient threats to Social Security and disability income?
We have not been directly involved in it, but that is only because our focus is primarily on state policy and that's federal policy. But we are part of a network of organizations that focus on fiscal policy generally and safety net policy. And I'm happy to report that there are many, many groups that work on that, and it's critical that we all stay informed and engaged about them. One of them that has great information and opportunities is the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. Their name is very similar to ours, but they're based in Washington, D.C., and they work nationally, and they're very engaged in all of the attempts to push back on Social Security. And I think that it really is critical for us to begin to have conversations and to inform and educate people about what these policies are and what they do and how they have worked in the past, and to kind of connect the dots a little bit too, and between Social Security and especially healthcare policy, since one of the things that tends to break families financially, especially when they're in their later years, is the cost of healthcare. And, here, again, I can tell you the story from my own family's perspective, right? They do get Social Security. They even get a veteran's benefit, and they're still paying almost $1,000 a month for the health care that my dad needs because he has Alzheimer's. And so the safety net, doesn't work, like you say. And what are we going to do about that? And how are we going to kind of come together and support changes in health care policy so that we aren't breaking families just based on that? Yeah.
I'm afraid we have about 2 minutes left, and I'm wondering if you would like to make kind of a closing statement or summary for your talk.
Yeah, I wish I had some sort of final words of wisdom to share. It really would, actually, what I'll do? What I want to do is, actually share one of my favorite quotes, which is, takes us back to the story that I told in the beginning, which is Margaret Mead, who once sort of famously said, never underestimate the power of a few committed citizens to change the world. And then she said, in fact, nothing else ever has. And if you think about it, and you think about the organization that I work for and what just a few people can do in a community of faith, like the Sisters in Boerne, Texas, right? There are stories like that everywhere, and don't be defeated. Don't think that just you and your little old self can't make a difference. You absolutely can. Sometimes we underestimate the networks that we have, and we also don't take advantage of all of the networks we have to have these conversations. Like maybe you're coming here and you're having these conversations in church because there's a forum for it, but you're not talking to your coworkers. You're not talking to your neighbors. You're not talking to your family members. Talk to them. Try to get them engaged however they can. There are lots of opportunities. Don't be defeated by all of the negative data. Be mad enough to get more active to change it for the next generation.
We want to thank you for your leadership and the leadership that the Center for Public Policy Priorities is taking on these issues and enhancing public awareness. These are the most important social issues and political and economic issues of our time. Thank you so much, Ann Beeson.
Thank you.